The neon sign of Midnight Haven flickered against the darkness like a lonely lighthouse on Route 17. Its red and blue glow reflected off the rain-slick asphalt outside, creating a small island of color in the desert night. Across the empty parking lot beyond the edge of light, the vast Nevada wilderness stretched into darkness, broken only by the occasional headlights on the distant highway. Inside the diner was a monument to a bygone America. Faded vinyl booths lined the windows, their once bright red now dulled to the color of old blood. A Wurlitzer jukebox stood in the corner, quietly playing Johnny Cash's Ghost Riders in the Sky, its notes floating through air thick with the scent of coffee and fried onions. Behind the counter, copper-bottomed pots hung from iron hooks, their surfaces worn to a dull sheen from decades of use. Frank Reynolds stood behind the counter, his weathered hands moving in practiced rhythm as he wiped down the smooth surface for the third time that hour. At 65, his body bore the marks of a hard life well lived. Silver hair clipped military short, deep lines, mapping his face like dry riverbeds, hands calloused from years of honest work. The scar that ran along his right jaw disappeared into his collar, a souvenir from his time with Desert Storm when he was a much younger man. The late shift at Midnight Haven was usually quiet, with only the occasional trucker stopping for coffee and pie. But Frank preferred it that way. After 30 years as Riverford's sheriff, he'd had enough excitement for one lifetime. The diner had been his retirement plan, a simple place where a simple man could find simple peace. At least that had been the idea. A flash of lightning illuminated the empty booths. 3 seconds later, thunder rolled across the valley. Frank's gaze drifted to the holstered Colt 45 tucked beneath the counter. Some habits die hard, especially for a man who'd worn a badge most of his life. In a town like Riverford, where the nearest help was 40 miles away, a man made his own security. He pulled the gun from its holster, feeling its familiar weight. The nickel-plated finish caught the light as his thumb traced the worn wooden grip. Frank began breaking down the piece with practiced movements, laying each component neatly on a clean white cloth. There was peace and routine in knowing exactly how something worked, in understanding the precise mechanisms of cause and effect. In the back kitchen, Sarah Mitchell worked quietly, preparing for tomorrow's breakfast rush. Barely 28, she had a quiet efficiency that reminded Frank of his late wife. Sarah had been at Midnight Haven for just under a year, but already the place ran smoother than it had in the decade before she arrived. Frank heard her humming softly as she worked some tune he didn't recognize. The distant rumble of motorcycles cut through the night, still miles away but approaching fast. Frank's hands paused over the dismantled firearm. He knew that sound. Anyone who'd lived in Riverford more than a month knew that sound. The Midnight Riders were coming. Frank reassembled the Colt with quick practice movements, but left it under the counter. With the Riders, you never knew what to expect, but violence rarely came without warning. Still better to be prepared. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Even in the harsh fluorescent light, she was pretty in that wholesome all-American way, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clear blue eyes that seemed too old for her young face. She'd been working double shifts lately, saving for nursing school, she'd told him, though Frank suspected the extra hours had more to do with avoiding going home. "Riders coming," Frank said simply. Sarah nodded but showed none of the fear most townspeople would at that announcement. Instead, she straightened her apron and began preparing the large coffee maker. That was another thing Frank liked about her. The girl had good sense. The thunder of engines grew louder, then suddenly cut as the motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. Through the large windows, Frank counted 4 bikes, their chrome gleaming, even in the dull neon light. The riders dismounted in unison, a choreographed movement born from years riding together. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, bringing with them the smell of rain leather and gasoline. The leader, Lucas Reed, removed his helmet, first revealing a face weathered by sun and road. At 45, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His dark beard was shot through with gray, but his eyes were sharp and alert, constantly scanning, assessing. Frank recognized that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror for decades. Behind Lucas came Bear Thompson, a mountain of a man whose nickname needed no explanation. 6'5" and built like a bulldozer, Bear's massive hands could bend metal and break bones with equal ease. Yet there was a gentleness to him that few outside the club ever saw, particularly when working on the vintage motorcycles he restored with almost fatherly care. Doc Miller followed slighter than the others, but no less imposing. The former Army medic had saved more lives than most emergency rooms, both on the battlefield and on the road. His medical bag was as much a part of him as the leather vest he wore, always within reach for when trouble found them, as it inevitably did. Last came Kid Jenkins, the youngest at 25, barely more than a prospect in the club's hierarchy. His eager eyes still held that dangerous shine of youth, the belief in his own immortality. But there was talent there too, particularly with electronics. In another life, he might have gone to MIT instead of finding family among outlaws. They took their usual booth in the far corner, where they could watch both the door and the highway beyond. None of them sat with their backs to the entrance. Old habits. "Evening, Frank," Lucas called out, his voice a gravelly rumble that matched the bikes they rode. "Lucas," Frank acknowledged with a nod, "riding late. Storm's coming in faster than expected. Thought we'd wait it out somewhere warm." Frank gestured to the empty diner. "Got the place to yourselves." Sarah approached their table with a coffee pot and 4 mugs, already familiar with their preferences. "The usual?" she asked, no hint of apprehension in her voice. "Appreciate it, Sarah," Lucas replied with a nod of thanks. "How's that little girl of yours?" A genuine smile softened Sarah's features. "Emma's good, growing too fast. She's sleeping in the back office tonight. Babysitter canceled last minute." Well, the men nodded in understanding. Single motherhood was hard enough without the irregular hours of diner work. As Sarah poured their coffee, Frank noticed how the sleeve of her uniform rode up slightly, revealing a bracelet of bruises around her wrist, fingerprint-shaped marks too deep to be accidental. When she turned to head back to the kitchen, Frank caught sight of her face in profile, the dim light revealing what makeup had hidden earlier. The shadow of a bruise at the corner of her mouth. Frank's jaw tightened. He'd seen those kinds of marks too many times during his years with a badge. The evidence of hands that should have protected turning violent instead. Lucas had noticed too. Their eyes met briefly across the diner, a silent communication between men who'd seen the same signs before. Lucas gave an almost imperceptible nod before turning back to his coffee. Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, and Frank busied himself wiping down the already spotless counter. His thoughts turned to Richard Mitchell, Sarah's husband, Riverford's deputy sheriff, and the town's golden boy. Son of Mayor Mitchell, former high school football star and pillar of the community. Or so everyone believed. Frank had his doubts about Richard long before Sarah started showing up with concealed bruises. There was something in the younger man's eyes that Frank recognized from his decades in law enforcement. A coldness that no amount of public charm could fully disguise. But accusations against the mayor's son would need more than an old man's intuition. The bell above the door jingled again, pulling Frank from his thoughts. An elderly couple entered, shaking rain from their coats. The Hendersons stopping for their weekly late-night tea and coffee after visiting their daughter in Carson City. Frank greeted them by name as they took their usual booth, purposely distant from the bikers. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying plates of food for the riders. Cheeseburgers for Lucas Bear and Kiddush Chef's salad for Doc, who despite his rough exterior, maintained the disciplined diet of a military man. She moved with practiced efficiency, but Frank noticed how she kept glancing at the wall clock. Nervous energy radiated from her like heat. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against the windows, and the lights flickered with each thunderclap. The Hendersons finished their pie and left hurrying through the downpour to their sedan. The midnight riders remained nursing their coffees in no hurry to face the deluge. Frank was refilling the sugar dispensers when Lucas approached the counter, coffee mug in hand. "Fresh pot, just brewed," Frank said, reaching for the carafe. Lucas held out his mug for a refill but kept his voice low. "How long has it been going on with Sarah?" Frank topped off the coffee, his movements unhurried. "Started noticing marks about 3 months ago. Getting worse." "Mitchell," Frank nodded. "Never saw it directly, but I know the signs. Town law won't help her. Not against the mayor's son." Frank's voice held the bitterness of a man who'd seen justice bend too many times for the well-connected. Lucas sipped his coffee, eyes distant with thought. "Remember Grenada, that night on the beach?" Frank's hands stilled momentarily. Few people knew he and Lucas had served together back when Lucas was a young Marine and Frank was the aging military police officer counting days until retirement. Fewer still knew about that particular night in '83 when an operation went sideways, and Frank made a choice that saved Lucas and 4 other Marines but ended his own military career. Long time ago, Frank said quietly. Not that long, I still owe you. You don't owe me anything. Lucas met his gaze directly. Man pays his debts, Frank, one way or another. Before Frank could respond, the diner's lights flickered again, then stabilized. Outside, the storm had reached its peak, rain hammering the roof like artillery fire. Gonna check the circuit breaker, Frank said, moving toward the back office. Storm like this, power is bound to go. The back office was small but tidy, dominated by a desk covered with invoices and scheduling sheets. In the corner on a small cot, 5-year-old Emma Mitchell slept soundly, her blonde curls spread across the pillow, one small hand clutching a well-worn teddy bear. Frank moved quietly past her to the electrical panel on the far wall. As he checked the circuits, he heard the office door open behind him. Sarah slipped in, her face tight with anxiety. "Everything okay?" Frank asked. She shook her head slightly, then glanced at her sleeping daughter. "Richard just called. He's been drinking at the Broken Spoke. Said he's coming here." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "When 20 minutes, maybe less." Frank closed the circuit box. "Take Emma and go out the back. I'll call when it's clear." Sarah hesitated. "He'll just be waiting at home, or come back tomorrow angrier." "Sarah, I can't keep running, Frank." There was a new resolve in her voice, steel beneath the fear. "Every time I do, it gets worse after." Frank knew she was right. Men like Richard Mitchell, fed on fear, grew stronger with each escape. It was a pattern Frank had seen play out countless times. The cycle of violence, apology, forgiveness, then violence again, each round more intense than the last. "At least let me get Emma somewhere safe," he suggested. Sarah nodded, visibly relieved. "Mrs. Garvey next door said Emma could stay any time. She understands. She knows." The unsaid words hung in the air. Mrs. Garvey understood because her own husband had been the same years ago, until liver failure did what the law wouldn't. "I'll take her," Frank said. "You tell Lucas and the boys what's happening, just in case." Sarah gently lifted her sleeping daughter, who stirred but didn't wake. Frank took the child in his arms, her weight barely noticeable to a man who'd carried wounded comrades off battlefields. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. Frank slipped out the back door into the rain, sheltering Emma beneath his jacket as he hurried to the neighboring house. Mrs. Garvey, a widow in her 70s, answered on the first knock, took one look at the sleeping child, and ushered them in without question. After settling Emma on the couch and explaining the situation in hushed tones, Frank headed back to the diner, rain plastering his silver hair to his skull. When he returned, Sarah was behind the counter, mechanically wiping down surfaces that didn't need cleaning. Lucas and his men had moved to different positions around the diner, Bear near the kitchen dock by the door, Kid casually blocking the route to the back exit. They weren't obviously preparing for trouble, but Frank recognized the tactical positioning. "Emma's safe," he told Sarah, who nodded without looking up. The next 15 minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the storm outside and the quiet music from the jukebox. Frank busied himself brewing a fresh pot of coffee, though he doubted anyone would drink it. They heard the vehicle before they saw it, the distinctive rumble of a police cruiser's engine cutting through the storm. Headlights swept across the diner's windows as the car pulled into the lot, parking at an angle that blocked 2 of the motorcycles. Sarah's hand froze mid-wipe. Frank moved closer to her, not obviously protective, but present. Lucas remained seated, apparently relaxed, but Frank noticed how his right hand had disappeared beneath the table. The cruiser's door opened, and Deputy Sheriff Richard Mitchell emerged into the rain without bothering with a coat. Even from a distance, his unsteady gait revealed his intoxication. Tall and classically handsome, with the build of a former athlete, Richard Mitchell looked every bit the small-town hero, until you noticed his eyes. Cold, empty, the eyes of a predator. He yanked open the diner's door hard enough to rattle the glass, the bell jangling discordantly. Water dripped from his uniform as he stood in the entrance, surveying the room with unfocused hostility. His gaze landed on Sarah, narrowed, then shifted to Frank, and finally to the Midnight Riders. "Well, well," he slurred, his handsome face twisted in a mockery of a smile. "Quite the gathering we got here." No one responded. The silence stretched, punctuated only by thunder. Richard stumbled toward the counter, one hand resting meaningfully on his service weapon. "I'm looking for my wife. Seems she forgot to tell me she was working late." Schedule change, Frank said evenly. My fault. Called her in when Darlene couldn't make it. Richard's eyes, bloodshot but cunning, shifted between them. That right, Sarah, just a schedule change. Sarah nodded, her face carefully blank. Yes. Funny thing, Richard continued, moving closer to her. I called Darlene. She's not sick. Said she wasn't even on the schedule tonight. Frank tensed but kept his voice neutral. My mistake then. Memory's not what it used to be. Richard ignored him, focusing entirely on Sarah now. Get your things. We're going home. Sarah didn't move. My shift isn't over, Richard. I don't care about your shift. His voice had dropped dangerously. Where's Emma? Sleeping at Mrs. Garvey's. I didn't want to wake her when Frank called me in. Richard's hands shot out, gripping Sarah's wrist hard enough to make her gasp. You're lying to me, again. Take your hand off her, Frank said quietly. Richard turned, his expression one of amused disbelief. Stay out of this, old man. This is between me and my wife. Not in my diner, it isn't. Frank's voice remained calm but carried the unmistakable authority of a man who'd spent decades giving orders that were obeyed. Richard released Sarah's wrist but didn't step back. Your diner funny. I was just reviewing some paperwork down at City Hall. Seems your fire inspection is overdue. Health department hasn't been by in a while either. Lot of regulations for running a place like this. Easy to miss something important. The threat hung in the air, blatant despite its indirect delivery. You threatening me, son? Frank asked, the last word deliberately condescending. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Just concerned for public safety, sir. He turned back to Sarah. Now get your things. She's not going anywhere with you, Lucas said, his voice cutting through the tension. He hadn't moved from his booth, hadn't raised his voice, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable. Richard's hand drifted back to his weapon. This doesn't concern you, Reed. You put hands on a woman in front of me, it becomes my concern. Lucas finally stood, his movements unhurried but purposeful. You're drunk, Mitchell, armed and drunk. That's a bad combination. I'm the law here, Richard said, his voice rising. You're just a bunch of criminals playing dress-up. Bear and Doc had moved closer now, their positions forming a loose perimeter. Kid remained by the back exit, watching silently. Right now, Lucas continued, as if Richard hadn't spoken. You're a man who's had too much to drink. Why don't you go sleep it off? Come back tomorrow when you're sober. Or what? You and your gang gonna do something about it? Richard's hand now rested on his holstered weapon, his trigger finger twitching. I could arrest every one of you right now. For what? Frank asked. I'll find something. Always do with their kind. Richard's eyes never left Lucas. Think I don't know what happens at that clubhouse of yours, the drugs, the women. Lucas remained perfectly still, but Frank saw the dangerous tightening around his eyes. The Midnight Riders had their code. No drugs, no forced prostitution, no senseless violence. They weren't angels, but they weren't the demons Richard was describing either. You're making accusations without evidence, Frank said. That badge doesn't give you the right to harass citizens without cause. Citizens? Richard laughed, an ugly sound. These aren't citizens. They're garbage. Road trash. He turned his attention back to Sarah, who had pressed herself against the back counter. Let's go. Now. When Sarah didn't move, Richard's control finally snapped. He lunged across the counter, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her forward. Plates and glasses crashed to the floor as Sarah cried out in pain. Frank moved faster than a man his age should have been able to, seizing Richard's wrist in a practiced hold that utilized pressure points rather than brute strength. Let her go, he ordered. For a moment, it seemed Richard would comply. Then he used his free hand to shove Frank backward, harder than necessary. Frank stumbled, his hip catching the edge of the counter, sending a jolt of pain through his aging body. Lucas was moving now, as were Bear and Doc, converging on Richard, who had pulled Sarah halfway across the counter, her face contorted in pain. Back off, Richard shouted, releasing Sarah to draw his weapon in one fluid motion. The service pistol swung in an arc, covering Lucas, then Bear, then back to Frank. All of you back the hell off. The situation had escalated faster than anyone had anticipated. Frank raised his hands slowly, showing empty palms. Richard, think about what you're doing. That's your career you're throwing away. Shut up. Richard's hand was shaking now, the gun unsteady in his grip. Sarah, get over here now. Sarah, free from his grasp, had retreated behind the counter. Richard, please, just go home. Sleep it off. We can talk tomorrow. I'm not asking again. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. The back door opened and a small voice called out, "Mommy!" Everyone froze. Emma Mitchell stood in the doorway, her teddy bear clutched to her chest, blonde curls damp from the rain. Her wide eyes took in the scene. Her father with gun drawn, her mother behind the counter, the bikers, and Frank with hands raised. "Emma," Sarah's voice was strangled with fear. "Baby, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be at Mrs. Garvey's." "She fell asleep," Emma said, her small voice somehow cutting through the tension like a knife. "I wanted to find you." Richard lowered his weapon slightly momentarily, thrown by his daughter's appearance. "Emma, come here, sweetie." The child didn't move. Her eyes, too knowing for her 5 years, remained fixed on the gun in her father's hand. "Are you going to hurt Mommy again?" she asked, her voice small but distinct. The question landed like a physical blow. Richard's expression shifted from anger to shock. "What? No, baby, I would never. You do, though," Emma continued with the terrible honesty of childhood. "You heard her all the time. I hear Mommy crying at night and after Chow get mad." The diner fell silent, except for the rain and distant thunder. In that moment, Richard's carefully maintained public image crumbled, completely exposed by the simple truth from a child's mouth. Richard holstered his weapon, his movements mechanical. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind confusion and something that might have been shame. "Emma, that's not... Daddy would never..." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't maintain the lie in the face of his daughter's steady gaze. Sarah moved quickly around the counter, gathering Emma into her arms and positioning herself between her daughter and Richard, the protective stance of a mother bear, primal and unflinching. "I think you should leave," Frank said quietly to Richard. "Now." For a moment it seemed Richard might argue. His eyes darted from Sarah to Emma to the bikers, calculating odds, weighing options. Then his shoulders slumped. "This isn't over," he muttered, backing toward the door. "Sarah, we'll discuss this at home." "No, Richard," Sarah said, her voice finding new strength with her daughter in her arms. "We won't." Richard's expression darkened again, but he said nothing more. He yanked open the door and disappeared into the storm, the cruiser's engine roaring to life moments later. Through the window they watched his taillights vanish down Route 17, headed back toward town. The tension in the diner ebbed gradually like air from a punctured tire. Lucas and his men exchanged glances but remained alert. They'd seen too many situations turn bad just when they seemed resolved. Sarah knelt before Emma, checking her daughter for any sign of harm. "How did you get here, baby? It's pouring outside." "I walked," Emma said simply. "Mrs. Garvey was snoring really loud and I was scared when I woke up and you weren't there." Sarah pulled her daughter close, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry you had to see any of this." Frank approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude on the moment between mother and daughter. "Sarah, you and Emma can stay at my place tonight. He doesn't know where I live." Sarah looked up, hesitation clear in her eyes. "Frank, I can't impose..." "It's not an imposition," he insisted gently. "I've got the spare room, it's just sitting empty." "I might have a better idea," Lucas said, stepping forward. He nodded toward the window where the storm had finally begun to abate, the rain reduced to a gentle patter. "The old Reynolds hunting cabin, up by Sawmill Creek." Frank raised an eyebrow in surprise. The cabin had belonged to his brother before his death 5 years ago. It was remote, accessible only by a dirt road that would be nearly invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. "How do you know about that place?" he asked. Lucas's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Your brother James let us use it sometimes, when things got hot in town or guys needed somewhere quiet to dry out." It was just like James, Frank thought. His brother had always seen the humanity in everyone, regardless of their reputation or appearance. It was why he'd been loved by all in Riverford, even those who lived on society's margins. "It's well stocked," Lucas continued. "Generator, propane stove, enough canned goods to last weeks. More importantly, it's off the grid. No paper trail. Mitchell would never find it." Sarah looked between them, hope and uncertainty battling in her expression. "But Richard will be looking for us. The whole sheriff's department will be." "Let them look," Lucas said with quiet confidence. "They won't find you there." Frank considered the idea. The cabin was indeed remote, nestled in a small valley that was nearly invisible until you were right on top of it. It had been a bootlegger's hideout during Prohibition before his grandfather purchased it in the 1940s. "It's your call, Sarah," he said finally. "But Lucas is right. You'd be safe there, at least until we figure out something more permanent." Sarah looked down at Emma, who was beginning to doze against her shoulder, the excitement and fear of the night catching up to her small body. "Okay," she said finally, "but I'll need to get some things from the house." "Not a good idea," Lucas said immediately. "Mitchell might be waiting." "I have medications, Emma's inhaler." "Make a list," Doc interrupted. "I can get replacements from the clinic in Carson City. Benefit of having worked there for 3 years." "And clothes?" Sarah asked. "I know your size," Frank said. "Got some contacts at the department store in Riverford. Can have everything you need by morning without raising suspicions." Sarah's eyes welled with grateful tears. "Why are you all doing this?" "You barely know me." It was Bear who answered, his deep voice surprising after his long silence. "My mama was married to a man like your husband. No one helped her." The big man shrugged his massive shoulders. "Sometimes all it takes is someone standing up when it matters." Frank nodded in agreement. How many times during his years as sheriff had he been called to domestic disturbances only to have the victim refuse to press charges? How many times had he seen the same women months later, their injuries worse, their spirits more broken? Sometimes the system worked. Often it didn't, especially when the abuser wore a badge or had connections. "We need to move quickly," Lucas said, checking his watch. "Mitchell's drunk, but he's not stupid. When his temper cools, he'll start thinking about where you might go." The plan came together with military precision. Kid would escort Sarah and Emma to the cabin on his motorcycle, taking a circuitous route to ensure they weren't followed. Doc would head to Carson City for medical supplies. Bear would return to the Midnight Riders clubhouse to organize additional security and supplies. Lucas would stay behind with Frank to clean up the diner and establish a plausible story about Sarah's sudden departure. Before they left, Lucas pulled Frank aside, keeping his voice low. "You know this isn't going to end tonight." Frank nodded grimly. "Mitchell won't let it go. His pride won't allow it. Then we need to be ready when he makes his next move." "We will be." Frank's eyes drifted to Sarah, who was helping Emma into a rain jacket borrowed from the diner's lost and found. This time she won't face it alone. Within 30 minutes, the plan was in motion. Kid's motorcycle disappeared into the night with Sarah and Emma taking back roads and game trails that only the riders knew. Doc headed toward Carson City, Bear to the clubhouse. The diner was quiet once more, with only Frank and Lucas remaining. "You should go too," Frank told Lucas as they wiped down the counter, removing any evidence of the earlier confrontation. "Mitchell has no love for you on the best of days." Lucas shook his head. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone, old man. I've handled worse." "Not recently," Lucas countered, "and not against a cop with a grudge and political connections." Frank couldn't argue with that assessment. Richard Mitchell wasn't just any deputy. He was the mayor's son, a local sports hero, and connected to half the business owners in Riverford. His word against Frank's would carry weight, especially if he decided to fabricate charges. "There's something you should know," Lucas said after a moment. "About Sarah." Frank paused in his cleaning. "What about her?" "Remember that motorcycle accident last year, my brother Danny?" Frank remembered. Danny Reed had been thrown from his bike on a sharp curve outside of town, the same curve that had claimed 3 other lives over the years. He'd been airlifted to Carson City Medical Center with critical injuries. "Sarah was the nurse who found him," Lucas continued. "She was driving home from a late shift, saw the wreck. If she hadn't stopped, used her training, Danny would have bled out before the ambulance arrived." "She never mentioned it," Frank said, surprised. "She wouldn't, not the type to seek credit." Lucas's eyes were distant with memory. "Danny told me later that she stayed with him the whole time, kept him talking, kept him alive through sheer force of will." It explained why Lucas and his men had shown such immediate concern for Sarah beyond the natural instinct to protect a woman in danger. There was history there, a debt of honor in their eyes. "Mitchell found out she'd helped Danny," Lucas added, his expression darkening. "That's when the bruises started, according to Danny. Mitchell hates us, hates anyone associated with us. Sarah paid the price for her kindness." Frank felt a cold anger settle in his chest. In his years wearing a badge, he'd learned to set aside personal feelings to enforce the law without emotion clouding his judgment. But now with the badge long gone, he allowed that anger to fuel his resolve. Then we make sure she doesn't pay anymore, he said simply. They worked in companionable silence after that, restoring the diner to its normal state. By the time they finished, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind the clean, sharp scent of desert rain. Dawn was still hours away, but the sky had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly in the east. Lucas stepped outside to smoke, leaning against his motorcycle and gazing toward the distant mountains. Frank joined him, the cool post-storm air a relief after the stuffiness of the diner. "You remember what you told me in Grenada?" Lucas asked, exhaling a stream of smoke. "After that night on the beach." Frank nodded slowly. "I told you there are two kinds of justice in this world, the kind that comes from laws and the kind that men make when laws fail. You also said knowing which kind is needed is the mark of wisdom." Lucas turned to look at Frank directly. "So which kind does Sarah need now?" Frank didn't answer immediately. In his younger days, the answer would have been automatic. The law was the only legitimate path to justice. But 40 years in law enforcement had taught him its limitations, especially in small towns, where connections often mattered more than evidence. "She needs to be safe," he said finally. "Her and Emma both, whatever that takes." Lucas nodded, satisfied with the answer. "The boys and I will keep watch on the cabin in shifts. Mitchell won't find them. And if he does," Lucas dropped a cigarette, crushing it beneath his boot, "then he'll learn why people fear the Midnight Riders." As if summoned by their conversation, the radio inside the diner crackled to life. The police band scanner Frank kept behind the counter, for old time's sake. Both men tensed at the sound of Richard Mitchell's voice, slightly distorted but unmistakable. "All units be on lookout for Sarah Mitchell and daughter Emma Mitchell, last seen at Midnight Haven Diner. Consider them endangered. Sarah Mitchell may be suffering mental distress and is not considered fit to have custody of the minor at this time. Approach with caution." Repeat, "approach with caution." Frank and Lucas exchanged grim looks. The battle lines had been drawn. "He's playing dirty already," Lucas muttered. Frank nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Then so will we." As the false dawn painted the Nevada desert in shades of gray and blue, the two men stood shoulder to shoulder outside the diner, united by an unlikely alliance and a common purpose. Behind them, the neon sign of Midnight Haven continued to flicker, a small beacon of light in the darkness. The storm had passed, but they knew another was coming, one that would test them all to their limits and change the small town of Riverford forever. The rising sun burned through the morning mist as Frank Reynolds drove his faded blue Ford pickup along the winding back roads of Riverford County. The cab smelled of coffee and gun oil, and beside him sat a cardboard box filled with essentials for Sarah and Emma. Frank had been up all night watching the road and listening to the police scanner, waiting for Richard Mitchell's next move. It came at dawn. The deputy sheriff had filed an official report claiming his wife had suffered a mental breakdown and kidnapped their daughter. Now every officer in the county was looking for them. The official story painted Richard as the concerned husband and father, Sarah as unstable and dangerous. It was a clever strategy that Frank had seen too many times before. In small towns like Riverford, perception quickly became reality, and Richard had just seized control of the narrative. The road to the cabin wound through pine forest that thinned as the elevation increased, eventually opening to scrubland that offered no place to hide. Frank checked his mirrors constantly. He was being cautious, perhaps overly so, but men like him didn't survive long careers in law enforcement by taking unnecessary risks. The cabin itself was invisible from the main forest road, nestled in a small depression behind a ridge of weather-worn granite. A narrow dirt track, easily mistaken for a game trail, provided the only access by vehicle. Frank downshifted as his truck began the steep descent, tires crunching on gravel and pine needles. The structure came into view as he rounded the final bend. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple two-room affair of weathered wood and fieldstone, but it was solid and secure. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, disappearing against the morning sky. Parked under a lean-to beside the cabin was Kid Jenkins' motorcycle covered with a tarp. Frank had barely stepped from his truck when the cabin door opened. Kid emerged first, his hand resting casually near the small of his back, where Frank knew he carried a 9mm Beretta. The young biker relaxed when he recognized the visitor. "All quiet?" Frank asked, lifting the box from his passenger seat. Kid nodded, his eyes still scanning the tree line. "Bear relieved me at midnight, then Doc took over at 4. Lucas called on the radio about an hour ago." Said you were coming. The door opened wider and Sarah appeared with Emma in her arms. The little girl's face lit up at the sight of Frank, but Sarah looked as though she hadn't slept at all. The bruise on her lip had darkened overnight, a stark reminder of what they were running from. Any problems? Frank asked as he carried the box inside. Sarah shook her head. Emma had a little trouble sleeping in a strange place, but otherwise we're fine. Her voice was steady, but Frank could see the strain around her eyes. What's happening in town? Frank set the box on the rough-hewn table that dominated the cabin's main room. Richards filed a report. Says you had some kind of breakdown, took Emma without permission. He kept his tone matter-of-fact, not wanting to frighten the child who was listening intently. Sarah's face paled. He's saying I'm crazy. Classic abuser tactic, Doc Miller said from where he sat by the fireplace cleaning his glasses with methodical precision. Discredit the victim, control the story. He's got the sheriff's department searching for you, Frank continued, and he's been talking to anyone who'll listen about your supposed mental issues. Sarah set Emma down gently. Honey, why don't you go look at the deer outside the back window? I think they're having breakfast too. Once the child was out of earshot, Sarah's calm facade cracked slightly. He'll take her from me, won't he? If they find us, he'll get custody. Not gonna happen, Doc said firmly. We've got evidence of his abuse. Medical documentation I put together last night, photographs of your injuries. Evidence doesn't always matter, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not when you're going against the mayor's son. Frank couldn't argue with her assessment. The justice system worked in theory, but in practice it was as vulnerable to bias and corruption as any human institution. That's why you're staying here until we figure out a more permanent solution, he said. The cabin doesn't exist on any official records. James made sure of that after he bought the surrounding land. As far as the county knows, this is just wilderness. Sarah looked around the sparse interior of the cabin, taking in the ancient wood stove, the mismatched furniture, the narrow beds in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was safe. How long do you think we'll need to stay? Frank exchanged glances with Doc. Hard to say, but we're working on something. What does that mean? It means we've got your back, Doc said, standing up and stretching his lean frame. Now I've brought your prescription refills and Emma's inhaler. Kid will stay with you today, and Bear will relieve him this evening. There's a radio if you need to contact us, but use it sparingly. Radio signals can be traced. Sarah looked like she wanted to ask more questions, but instead she nodded, accepting their help with quiet dignity. Frank admired her resilience. Many would have crumbled under the pressure, but Sarah Mitchell was made of sterner stuff. I should get back to the diner, Frank said. Keep up appearances. I'll walk you out, Doc said, following Frank to the door. Outside, with the cabin door closed behind them, Doc's professional demeanor slipped slightly. Lucas called while you were on your way. Richard's been to the clubhouse already with 2 state troopers. Claimed he had information about illegal activities. Frank's jaw tightened. He's casting a wide net. They didn't find anything, of course. We cleaned house as soon as Sarah and Emma left the diner, but it's only going to escalate from here. He's desperate, Frank observed. Makes him dangerous. Doc nodded grimly. Lucas is staying in town keeping an eye on things. Said to tell you he'll stop by the diner later. Frank climbed back into his truck, his aging joints protesting the movement. Keep them safe, Doc. With my life, the former medic promised. Frank took a different route back a longer path that followed old logging roads before eventually connecting with the county highway. The extra time gave him space to think, to consider their next moves in what was rapidly becoming a dangerous game. By the time he reached the outskirts of Riverford, the morning rush at Midnight Haven would be well underway. The diner served as Frank's legitimate public face, and maintaining normal operations was crucial to their plan. Any deviation from routine would raise suspicions. The parking lot was nearly full when he arrived, a good sign. The breakfast crowd included the usual mix of locals, truckers, and travelers passing through. Frank nodded to the morning waitress Carol, who had been handling things in his absence. Busy morning, he asked, hanging up his jacket. Steady, Carol replied, loading plates onto a tray. Had some visitors asking about Sarah, though. Frank kept his expression neutral. Oh, 2 deputies, not Richard. Wanted to know when I'd last seen her. Said she didn't come home last night. What did you tell them? Carol snorted. That I wasn't her keeper. That woman works harder than anyone in this town raises a child alone for all practical purposes. If she decided to take a day off, more power to her. Frank allowed himself a small smile. Carol Johnson was a 60-year-old widow with no filter and no patience for nonsense. She'd worked at the diner since before Frank bought it and knew every secret in Riverford, including some of Richard Mitchell's indiscretions. They believe you. Doesn't matter if they did, it's the truth. I haven't seen Sarah since my shift ended yesterday. Frank poured himself coffee and retreated to the small office behind the kitchen. The room still held traces of Emma's presence from the night before a small stuffed bear forgotten in the rush to leave. Frank tucked it into a drawer for safekeeping, then settled in to review the previous day's receipts, maintaining the appearance of business as usual. Mid-morning brought another visitor. Sheriff Tom Blackwood entered the diner alone, removing his hat as he scanned the room. At 58, Blackwood was only a few years younger than Frank, and the two men had a complicated history. They'd worked together for nearly 2 decades, but their approaches to law enforcement had often put them at odds. Blackwood was a political animal adept at navigating the small-town power structures, while Frank had always been more concerned with justice than politics. It was one of many reasons Frank had chosen to retire when he did. Frank, Blackwood greeted him, sliding into a booth in the corner. Got a minute? Frank brought the coffee pot and 2 mugs, sitting across from his former colleague. Tom, what brings you by? Don't usually see you this far from the courthouse. Blackwood added cream to his coffee, stirring it longer than necessary. Got a situation, Frank. Thought you might be able to help sort it out. If it's about the Mitchell girl, Carol already told your deputies I haven't seen her. Come on, Frank. Blackwood's voice was tired. We both know better than that. Sarah was working here last night. Richard came by looking for her. There was some kind of altercation. If you're so well informed, what do you need from me? Blackwood leaned forward. I need to know where they are, Frank. This situation is getting complicated fast. Why? Because Richard's spinning some tale about Sarah being unstable. You think I don't know what's going on in my own department? Blackwood's voice dropped to a near whisper. Richard's got problems. I'm not blind. But right now he's got his father breathing down my neck, and the mayor's calling in every favor owed to him. Frank studied the sheriff carefully. Despite their differences over the years, Blackwood had never struck him as corrupt, merely pragmatic. So what are you saying, Tom? I'm saying if I find Sarah and Emma, I have to bring them in. It's my job. But if someone else were to help them get to Carson City, to the women's shelter there, where they'd be beyond Richard's immediate reach. He left the thought unfinished. Frank kept his expression neutral, but internally he was reassessing the man across from him. Hypothetically, that someone would need documentation of the abuse. Medical records, photographs, witness statements. Blackwood nodded almost imperceptibly. The shelter director in Carson City, though, is Marina Diaz, former prosecutor. She knows how to prepare a case that will stand up in court. Hypothetically, Frank said after a moment, getting them there would be tricky. Richard's got roadblocks on all the main highways. County maintenance is replacing culverts on Old Mill Road tomorrow morning. That section will be off the patrol schedule from 6 to noon. Blackwood finished his coffee and stood. But you didn't hear that from me. Frank watched the sheriff leave, considering this unexpected turn of events. Blackwood was taking a significant risk by providing this information. It suggested the situation in town might be even more volatile than Frank had realized. The lunch rush came and went. Frank moved through the routines of the diner automatically, his mind occupied with planning. Old Mill Road would take them within 5 miles of the Carson City limits, but it was a treacherous route, particularly the section known as Devil's Backbone, a narrow ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides. Not a road he'd choose under normal circumstances, especially with a child in the vehicle. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Frank from his thoughts. Lucas Reed entered, flanked by Bear. Both men looked tired but alert, scanning the diner before approaching the counter where Frank was wiping down the surface. Coffee, Frank offered, already reaching for mugs. Lucas nodded, taking a seat at the counter. Bear remained standing, his massive frame positioned to watch both the entrance and the parking lot. Richard paid us another visit, Lucas said quietly once Frank had served them coffee. This time with a search warrant. Frank's eyebrows rose. That was fast. Judge Harper signed it. Richard claimed he had an anonymous tip that we were harboring his wife and daughter. Judge Harper was the mayor's golfing partner and a notorious rubber stamp for law enforcement. It wasn't surprising he'd issued a warrant on flimsy evidence. They find anything? Lucas shook his head. Place was clean, but Richard made it personal. Had the officers tear the clubhouse apart, cut open furniture, dump out food supplies. Wanted to send a message. Frank understood the significance. It wasn't just about finding Sarah and Emma anymore. Richard was directly challenging the Midnight Riders, a dangerous move in a town where the club held considerable influence despite their outlaw reputation. There's more, Lucas continued, his voice dropping further. Richard's been talking to the Broken Skulls. Frank felt a chill at the mention of the rival motorcycle club based in neighboring Carbon County. Where the Midnight Riders operated with a code of honor, the Broken Skulls had none. They were involved in drug trafficking, weapons, and worse. A long-standing truce had kept the peace between the two clubs for years, but it was an uneasy peace at best. What's he offering them? Free passage through Riverford for their product. No police interference. The implications were stark. If Richard succeeded in forging an alliance with the Broken Skulls, the balance of power would shift dramatically. The Midnight Riders would be outmanned and outgunned, and Riverford would become a waypoint in a drug pipeline that stretched from Mexico to Canada. We can't let that happen, Frank said. No, Lucas agreed. We can't. The three men fell silent, each contemplating the rapidly escalating stakes. What had begun as an effort to protect one woman and her child from an abusive husband had morphed into something far more complex and dangerous. Bear broke the silence. Sheriff Blackwood came by the garage this morning, asked a lot of questions about Richard. Frank shared his earlier conversation with Blackwood, including the information about Old Mill Road. Lucas listened intently, his expression thoughtful. You trust him? Not completely, Frank admitted, but his information checks out. County maintenance schedule shows the Old Mill Road project starting tomorrow. Lucas nodded slowly. Getting Sarah and Emma to Carson City would be a good first step. The women's shelter there has connections to a network that can move them further if necessary, even out of state. But it doesn't solve the Richard problem, Frank pointed out. No, Lucas agreed. It doesn't. The conversation was interrupted by Frank's phone ringing. Few people had the number for the diner's private line, and fewer still would use it instead of his cell phone, Frank answered with caution. Midnight Haven. Frank, it's Doc. The medic's voice was tense. We might have a problem. Kids spotted a drone flying over the area about 20 minutes ago. Too high to tell if it was just a hobbyist or something else, but it circled the ridge twice. Frank felt his stomach tighten. Any other signs of activity? Nothing yet, but I've moved Sarah and Emma to the storm cellar as a precaution. If someone is searching the area, the cabin is well hidden, but better safe than sorry. We'll be there in 30, Frank said, ending the call and relaying the information to Lucas and Bear. Lucas was already on his feet. I'll take point. Bear, you follow Frank. Different routes converge at the Lower Creek crossing. The men moved with practiced efficiency, their earlier fatigue forgotten in the surge of adrenaline. Within minutes, they were on the road, Frank's pickup trailing behind Lucas's motorcycle by several minutes, with Bear bringing up the rear at a similar interval. The drone could be nothing, Frank tried to tell himself. The remote location had its share of hikers, photographers, and nature enthusiasts, any of whom might be using drone technology these days. But the timing was suspicious, and in Frank's experience, coincidences were rare in situations like this. The drive to the cabin seemed longer than it had that morning. Every vehicle Frank passed became a potential threat, every curve in the road a possible ambush point. By the time he turned onto the unmarked dirt track that led to the cabin, his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Lucas had already arrived, his motorcycle parked beside Kid's. Doc met Frank outside, his medical bag slung over one shoulder. Any more drone activity? Frank asked. Doc shook his head. Nothing, but something spooked the deer about 10 minutes ago. They bolted from the meadow on the north side. It could be mountain lions or coyotes, Frank knew, or it could be someone approaching on foot using the natural contours of the land for cover. Either way, they needed to move quickly. Bear's motorcycle rumbled into view, the big man bringing his bike to a stop beside the others. Followed your dust trail in, he explained to Frank. Road's clear behind us for now. Inside the cabin, Sarah sat at the table with Emma on her lap, reading a story from one of the old books that had belonged to Frank's nieces decades ago. She looked up as the men entered, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Is it time to go?" she asked simply. Frank nodded. "Pack only what you absolutely need. We're taking the back trail to Old Mill Road." While Sarah gathered their few belongings, the men conferred in low voices by the door. "If it was a surveillance drone, they'll have the main roads covered," Lucas said. "We'll need to create a diversion." "I can take my truck north on Forest Service Road 27, Bear offered. "Make it look like we're heading for the state line. Should draw any patrols in that direction." "Kid and I will run interference on the main highway," Lucas added. "Two bikes moving fast, making sure we're seen. With any luck, they'll think Sarah and Emma are with one of us." The plan was risky, but sound. With attention divided between multiple decoys, Frank would have a better chance of slipping through with Sarah and Emma via the less traveled Old Mill Road. "What about Doc?" Frank asked. "I'll stay here," the medic replied. "Make it look like the cabin's still occupied. Light in the windows, smoke from the chimney. If anyone comes to check, I'll delay them as long as possible." Each man understood the dangers inherent in their roles. If Richard had indeed made an alliance with the Broken Skulls, they were up against an enemy with few scruples and considerable resources. But the alternative, abandoning Sarah and Emma to Richard's justice, was unthinkable. Sarah emerged from the back room with a small duffel bag, Emma close beside her. The little girl's eyes were wide with anxiety, sensing the tension around her, though not understanding its source. Frank knelt to her level. "We're going on a little adventure, Emma. You and your mom are going to ride with me in my truck." Emma looked up at her mother, then back to Frank. "Is the bad man coming?" The simple question, delivered with a child's directness, cut through the tactical planning like a knife. For all their strategies and countermeasures, at the heart of this situation was a frightened little girl and her mother running from someone who should have been their protector. "No, sweetheart," Frank assured her gently. "The bad man isn't going to find you. I promise." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. In his long career, Frank had learned the danger of promises he might not be able to keep. But looking into Emma's trusting eyes, he silently vowed to do whatever was necessary to make his words truth. The plan was set in motion as dusk approached. Bear left first, taking Forest Service Road 27 north in Frank's truck, the vehicle easily visible with its distinctive faded blue paint. 30 minutes later, Lucas and Kid mounted their motorcycles, heading south toward the main highway, where they would execute a high-speed run designed to draw attention and resources. Frank waited with Sarah and Emma in the deepening shadows at the edge of the clearing, watching as Doc maintained the illusion of normal activity inside the cabin. When full darkness fell, they would make their move, taking a seldom-used trail that would eventually connect with the Old Mill Road several miles from the highway junction. "Are you sure this is going to work?" Sarah whispered as they waited. Emma had finally fallen asleep in her arms, exhausted by the tension and activity. "No," Frank admitted, "but it's our best option right now." Sarah nodded, accepting his honesty. "I never thought it would come to this. Running in the night, hiding like criminals." "You're not the criminal in this situation, Sarah. Tell that to the sheriff's department, to the people in town who believe Richard's story." Her voice held no self-pity, only a weary resignation. "You know what the worst part is? I saw the signs early on. The jealousy, the need to control everything. But I told myself it would get better after we were married, after Emma was born." It was a common refrain Frank had heard from countless victims over the years. The belief that love could change someone, that commitment would curb violent tendencies rather than exacerbate them. "Richard fooled a lot of people," Frank said. "He's had years of practice presenting one face to the world and another behind closed doors." "But not you," Sarah observed. "You saw through him." Frank considered this. "I recognize certain patterns. When you've been in law enforcement as long as I was, you develop instincts about people." "I'm grateful for those instincts," Sarah said softly. "Without you and the riders, I don't know what would have happened last night." The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted their conversation. Frank tensed his hand, moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. But the distinctive rumble of the engine identified it as Bear's motorcycle rather than Frank's truck. Bear killed the engine before reaching the cabin, coasting the last 100 yards in silence. He disappeared inside briefly to speak with Doc, then rejoined Frank and Sarah at the edge of the clearing. Change of plans, he said without preamble. Highway Patrol has set up checkpoints on both ends of Old Mill Road. Someone tipped them off. Frank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The revised route Blackwood had suggested was already compromised. Either the sheriff had deliberately misled them, or Richard had somehow anticipated their move. What about Lucas and Kid? No contact yet. They should have reached the highway by now. Sarah clutched Emma closer. So we're trapped. Bear shook his massive head. Not trapped. Just need a new exit strategy. He turned to Frank. There's another way out, through Broken Skull territory. Frank frowned. That's suicide, especially now. Maybe not, Bear said. I know someone in the Skulls, owe him from way back. If I can reach him, he might help us slip through their lines. It was a desperate play, relying on a personal debt that might or might not still hold weight. But their options were dwindling rapidly. A faint sound reached them, barely audible at first, but growing stronger. Frank recognized it immediately, the thudding rhythm of helicopter rotors. Police helicopter, he said grimly. They're expanding the search area. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the sweep of a spotlight through the trees to the north. They had minutes at most before the aircraft reached their position. Go with Bear, Frank told Sarah. He'll get you and Emma to the contact in the Broken Skulls. I'll stay here with Doc, create a diversion. No, Sarah protested. You've risked enough already. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for us. This isn't a debate, Frank said firmly. Bear has the best chance of getting you through. I'll be fine. The helicopter was closer now, with searchlight methodically sweeping the forest in a grid pattern. Soon it would reach the clearing where the cabin stood exposed. Frank made a quick decision. Change of plans. Doc and I will take my truck, make a run for the highway. Should draw them away from here. Bear, once we're gone, take Sarah and Emma to your contact. Use the game trails, stay off the roads. Doc emerged from the cabin, alerted by the approaching helicopter. Frank quickly outlined the revised plan. The medic nodded, his expression grim, but determined. Godspeed, Frank told Bear, then turned to Sarah. Trust him. He'll get you to safety. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for everything. There was no time for further goodbyes. Doc was already heading for the hidden vehicle they'd stashed as a contingency, a battered Land Rover concealed beneath camouflage netting in a thicket nearby. Frank followed, pausing only briefly to look back at Sarah and the sleeping child in her arms, wondering if he would ever see them again. The helicopter was almost directly overhead now, its powerful spotlight cutting through the darkness like a surgeon's scalpel. Frank and Doc reached the Land Rover just as the light began to sweep toward the cabin clearing. They had seconds at most before they would be exposed. Doc fired up the engine while Frank quickly disabled the vehicle's taillights. They would drive dark, a dangerous tactic, but necessary to avoid immediate detection from the air. As they pulled away from their hiding spot, Frank caught a glimpse of Bear leading Sarah and Emma in the opposite direction, disappearing into the dense undergrowth like shadows. The Land Rover bounced and jolted as Doc navigated the rough terrain without headlights, relying on moonlight and memory to avoid the worst obstacles. Frank held onto the dashboard, his aging body protesting every impact. Behind them, the helicopter's spotlight found the cabin, illuminating it in harsh white light. They'll have ground units moving in, Frank said, raising his voice over the engine's roar. We need to draw them away from Bear's road. Doc nodded, swerving onto a fire road that led toward the highway. Where's our fallback point? The old mining complex near Eagle Peak. If we get separated, that's where we regroup. The helicopter had detected their movement. Its spotlight swung in their direction, searching the trees for the source of the disturbance. Doc accelerated, pushing the Land Rover to its limits as they raced through the forest. The radio crackled to life, Bear's deep voice barely audible through the static. Package secure. Moving to delivery point. Radio silence from here. Frank acknowledged with a brief transmission, then switched off the radio. Electronic silence was their best defense now. The spotlight found them just as they emerged from the tree line onto a wider dirt road. The helicopter banked sharply, dropping lower as it pursued. Over its loudspeaker came the expected command, "Vehicle on Forestry Road 14, stop immediately. This is the sheriff's department." Doc responded by pushing the accelerator to the floor. The Land Rover shot forward its engine, screaming in protest as they hit 40, then 50 miles per hour on the rough road. They'll have called in our position. Frank said, checking the revolver at his hip and the shotgun secured beneath the seat. Ground units will be converging. How long do we need to buy Bear? Frank calculated quickly. At least an hour, longer if possible. Doc's face was grim in the dim glow from the dashboard. Then an hour it is. The helicopter stayed with them, its spotlight locked on the Land Rover as it bounced and skidded along the increasingly treacherous road. Ahead, Frank could see the dark ribbon of the highway, and beyond it the sprawling complex of abandoned mine buildings that dotted Eagle Peak. Doc cut the headlights completely as they approached the highway, relying solely on the helicopter's spotlight for visibility. It was a risky move that nearly ended in disaster as they almost collided with a highway patrol car racing toward their position. The patrol car's driver swerved at the last moment, sliding off the road into a shallow ditch. Doc didn't slow down, plunging across the highway and into the labyrinth of dirt roads that serviced the abandoned mining complex. Here, among the rusted equipment and collapsing structures, they held the advantage. Doc had grown up in these hills, had played among these ruins as a child. He knew every blind corner, every hidden passage, every dangerous sinkhole. The helicopter pilot following from above did not. They weaved through the complex at breakneck speed, dust billowing behind them, using the larger structures for momentary cover from the spotlight. The helicopter pilot struggled to maintain visual contact, forced to climb higher to avoid the taller structures and the treacherous power lines that still crisscrossed the site. "We need to split them up," Frank said as they rounded a massive ore processing building. "Ground units will be approaching from the highway." Doc nodded, spinning the wheel as they emerged on the far side of the complex. "Hang on." The Land Rover plunged down a steep embankment that had once served as a rail line for ore cars. At the bottom, Doc cut hard right, taking them into a tunnel that burrowed into the hillside. The helicopter's spotlight swept frantically across the area, losing them in the darkness. Inside the tunnel, Doc finally slowed, allowing Frank to catch his breath. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of abandoned machinery. "They'll seal off the other exit," Frank said, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Who said anything about using the exit?" Doc replied with a grim smile. He guided the Land Rover deeper into the tunnel, eventually stopping at what appeared to be a cave-in. But as he cut the engine and stepped out, Frank realized it was actually a cleverly disguised side passage, partially blocked by debris that could be moved. "Old Smuggler's Road," Doc explained as they began clearing the passage. "Prohibition era. My grandfather was a bootlegger before he was a miner." It took them 10 minutes of hard labor to clear enough space for the Land Rover to squeeze through. Beyond the blockage, the tunnel continued for another quarter-mile before opening into a narrow canyon invisible from the air. "We've bought maybe 20 minutes, Doc said as they emerged into the canyon. "They'll figure out we've disappeared and start widening the search area." Frank checked his watch. They'd been running for almost 40 minutes since leaving the cabin. "Not enough time yet. Bear needs at least another hour to reach his contact and get Sarah and Emma to safety." "Then we keep running," Doc said, simply restarting the engine. "Give them a target they can't resist." Frank nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for this man he'd once considered little more than an outlaw. The Midnight Riders were proving to be far more than their reputation suggested. The canyon offered them a temporary respite, its narrow walls preventing helicopter pursuit, but it eventually opened onto another Forest Service road, leaving them exposed once more. They had barely traveled a mile when the helicopter reacquired them, its spotlight pinning the Land Rover like a specimen on a card. This time, the amplified voice from above held a new level of threat. "Vehicle on Forest Service Road 22, stop immediately. This is your final warning. We are authorized to use force." Frank spotted the flash of red and blue lights in the distance, ground units approaching from both directions. They were running out of both road and options. "Ideas?" Doc asked, his voice tight with tension. Frank scanned their surroundings, looking for any possible escape route. The dense forest pressed close on both sides, too thick for the Land Rover to navigate. Ahead, the road curved sharply around a hillside, temporarily blocking the view of the approaching patrol cars. "There," Frank said, pointing to a narrow fire break that cut through the trees at a sharp angle. "Can you make that turn at this speed?" Doc's hands tightened on the wheel. Only one way to find out. The Land Rover hit the turn at nearly 60 miles per hour, tires screaming in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, Frank thought they wouldn't make it, that the vehicle would roll or slide off the road entirely. But Doc's skill prevailed, guiding them into the narrow gap between the trees with inches to spare. The helicopter overshot their position, its spotlight sweeping emptiness where they should have been. The patrol cars, too, raced past the hidden turn, their sirens dopplering away into the night. Doc didn't slow down, pushing the Land Rover along the rough firebreak at dangerous speed. Branches clawed at the vehicle, scraping along its sides with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The narrow path began to climb, taking them higher into the hills. "Where does this lead?" Frank asked, fighting to stay upright as they bounced over the uneven ground. "Old fire watchtower," Doc replied through gritted teeth. "Abandoned in the 90s when they built the new one with better road access." The firebreak ended abruptly at a small clearing dominated by a skeletal tower that rose against the night sky like an accusing finger. Doc circled the Land Rover around the base of the tower and cut the engine. "Now what?" Frank checked his watch again. They'd been on the run for just over an hour. Bear should have reached his contact by now, should be moving Sarah and Emma towards safety. But there was no way to confirm without breaking radio silence. "We wait," Frank said. "Give them time to search the area below. When they move on, we double back to the highway." Doc nodded, leaning back in his seat with a sigh. The adrenaline that had sustained them was ebbing, leaving behind the leaden weight of exhaustion. Neither man had slept in over 24 hours, and the stress of the situation was taking its toll. The distant sound of the helicopter circling the area where they disappeared from view was oddly comforting. As long as the searchers were looking in the wrong place, Bear had a better chance of getting Sarah and Emma to safety. Frank's thoughts turned to Lucas and Kid, who should have completed their diversionary run by now. Had they succeeded in drawing attention away from the cabin area? Were they safe, or had they encountered complications of their own? The radio remained silent, as it should. Any transmission now might give away someone's position. They would maintain electronic silence until they reached the designated rendezvous point, an abandoned church on the outskirts of Carson City that the Midnight Riders sometimes used as a way station. The minutes stretched into an hour, then two. The helicopter sound grew fainter, then disappeared entirely as the search area shifted. The night grew colder, and both men dozed in fits and starts, one always remaining alert while the other rested. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Frank made the call. "Time to move. We'll take the back way down, see if we can reach the highway without being spotted." Doc nodded, his face haggard with fatigue, but his eyes clear and determined. He started the Land Rover, its engine sound muffled by the dense trees surrounding the clearing. The descent was slower than their ascent had been, Doc taking care to avoid unnecessary noise that might give away their position. The forest was quiet in the pre-dawn stillness. The only sounds the soft crunch of tires on dirt and the occasional call of a waking bird. They were halfway down the mountains when Doc suddenly braked, bringing the Land Rover to a halt. Frank followed his gaze and felt his heart sink. Blocking the narrow path ahead was a police cruiser, its light bar dark, but its presence unmistakable. "Trap," Doc whispered. Frank studied the vehicle more carefully. It was positioned at an odd angle, not directly across the path, but at a slant as if it had slid to a stop. And there was no movement, no sign of officers waiting in ambush. "I don't think so," Frank said slowly. "Something's off." Doc reached beneath his seat, pulling out a compact pair of binoculars. He studied the cruiser for a long moment before passing them to Frank. "Driver's side window is shattered. Can't see if anyone's inside." Frank peered through the binoculars, confirming Doc's observation. The cruiser's driver's window was indeed broken glass glittering on the ground beside the vehicle. There was a dark stain on the door that might have been blood. "Could be bait," Doc suggested. "Get us to approach, then spring the trap." It was possible, Frank acknowledged, but his instincts were telling him something else, something that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. "Back up. Find another route down." Doc didn't argue, shifting the Land Rover into reverse. But before he could move, the radio crackled to life, breaking their self-imposed silence. "Frank, Doc, anyone receiving?" It was Lucas, his voice tense. "Emergency override. Respond, if you are hearing this." Frank grabbed the radio. "We're here. What's happened?" Lucas's relief was audible. "Thank God, we've got a situation. The Broken Skulls turned on Bear. They were working with Richard all along." Frank felt a cold dread settle in his chest. Sarah and Emma. Safe for now. Bear got them to a fallback position. But he's hurt bad and they're pinned down. Richard and a group of skulls are closing in on their position. Doc was already turning the Land Rover around, heading back up the path toward an intersecting fire road that would take them in the direction of Bear's likely position. "Where are you?" Frank asked Lucas. "5 miles east of the Deepwood cabin. There's an old prospector's shack in a box canyon." Bear managed to get them there before he collapsed. Frank knew the location. It was defensible but isolated with only one way in or out. If Richard and the Broken Skulls had indeed formed an alliance, Bear, Sarah, and Emma were in grave danger. "We're on our way," Frank said. "ETA 20 minutes if we push it." "Make it 15, Lucas replied grimly. "And Frank Richards not just after Sarah and Emma anymore. He wants all of us gone. This has turned into a war." As Doc accelerated up the steep fire road, Frank felt a grim determination replace his fatigue. The stakes had risen beyond protecting one family from an abusive husband. Now they were fighting for their own survival against a corrupt deputy and a ruthless motorcycle gang. The sun was breaking over the eastern mountains as they raced toward what promised to be a decisive confrontation. Whatever happened in the next few hours would change Riverford forever. Frank only hoped they would all live to see it. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the Nevada sky in shades of amber and gold. Frank Reynolds gripped the doorframe of the Land Rover as Lucas Miller navigated the treacherous mountain roads at speeds that sent rocks and dust cascading into the ravine below. Every jolt sent pain through Frank's aging joints, but the discomfort barely registered. His thoughts remained fixed on the desperate situation ahead. "How much farther?" Frank asked, checking his revolver for the third time. 2 miles. Lucas replied, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "There's an old mining trail that should get us within a quarter-mile of the prospector's shack. We'll have to go the rest on foot." The radio crackled to life again. Lucas's voice came through in bursts, broken by static and what might have been gunfire. "Frank, situation deteriorating. Bear needs medical. Holding them off, but ammunition running low." Lucas pressed the accelerator harder, sending the Land Rover lurching around a hairpin turn with two wheels briefly leaving the ground. Frank braced himself, his military training and decades of law enforcement experience settling into a familiar calm. The chaos of approaching combat had always brought clarity rather than panic, a trait that had saved his life more times than he could count. "There," Lucas said, suddenly pointing to a barely visible track that branched off from the main fire road. He swung the vehicle sharply and they plunged into dense underbrush that scratched along the sides like desperate fingers. The trail quickly deteriorated from bad to worse. Twice they had to stop to clear fallen branches, precious minutes ticking away with each delay. Finally, Lucas brought the Land Rover to a halt behind a large outcropping of rock. "End of the road," he said grimly. "We're on foot from here." Frank grabbed the shotgun from beneath the seat and checked that it was loaded. Lucas retrieved his medical bag and a semi-automatic pistol from the glove compartment. Neither man spoke as they oriented themselves, then set off at a jog through the pine forest that surrounded the canyon. Despite his age, Frank moved with practiced efficiency, placing each foot carefully to minimize noise. Lucas followed close behind, his breathing controlled despite the rapid pace and rising elevation. Both men were listening intently for any sound that might indicate the presence of Richard or his newfound allies, the Broken Skulls. They paused at the edge of a ridge that overlooked the box canyon. The prospector's shack was visible below a dilapidated structure of weathered wood and corrugated metal nestled against the canyon wall. From this vantage point, Frank could see Kid Jenkins positioned on the roof, a rifle in hand, as he scanned the surrounding area. There was no sign of the others. Lucas pointed to movement in the tree line approximately 200 yards from the shack. Even without binoculars, Frank could make out the distinctive leather vests of the Broken Skulls. He counted at least 4 figures moving from cover to cover, slowly encircling the shack. "They're setting up a siege," Frank observed quietly, "waiting for reinforcements before making their move." Lucas nodded. "Classic military-style containment. Someone down there has training." Frank's jaw tightened. Richard Mitchell had served 4 years in the Army before returning to Riverford. The tactical approach suggested he was directing the operation rather than leaving it to the Broken Skulls, whose usual method was brute force rather than strategy. "We need to reach the shack," Frank said. "Let them know help is coming and assess Bear's condition." Lucas studied the terrain. "There's a drainage channel on the east side. Flash floods carved it out years ago. It doesn't provide complete cover, but it's better than going in exposed." Frank nodded. "You take the channel. Your medical skills are needed more than mine. I'll create a diversion from the West Ridge, draw their attention away from your approach. Lucas looked like he might argue, but instead clasped Frank's shoulder briefly. Watch yourself, old man. Always do, Frank replied with a grim smile. Give me 5 minutes, then make your move. They separated, Lucas heading east, while Frank worked his way along the ridge line to a position that would give him a clear view of the Broken Skull's positions. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying sound with unnerving clarity. Frank could hear voices below, though not clearly enough to make out words. When he reached a suitable vantage point, Frank chambered around in the shotgun. The sound echoed slightly in the stillness, but he was beyond caring about stealth now. They needed a distraction, something to pull attention away from Lucas's approach, and ideally draw some of the skulls away from the shack entirely. Frank took aim at a dead tree near one group of broken skulls and squeezed the trigger. The shotgun's report thundered through the canyon, and the tree splintered, sending fragments raining down on the men below. They scattered in confusion, then returned fire bullets whining past as Frank ducked behind a boulder. The diversion worked. 3 of the skulls broke cover, moving toward Frank's position while shouting to each other. From his hiding place, Frank could see Lucas using the opportunity to sprint along the drainage channel, keeping low, and using every bit of available cover. Frank fired again this time, aiming over the heads of his pursuers. He had no desire to kill if it could be avoided, but he needed to maintain their attention. The broken skulls returned fire with considerably less restraint, bullets chipping away at the boulder that sheltered him. Through the gap between rocks, Frank saw Lucas reach the shack, disappearing around its back wall, where a door or window presumably offered entry. One part of their plan had succeeded. Now Frank needed to withdraw before the skulls reached his position or outflanked him. He fired once more, then began moving laterally along the ridge, keeping low and using the scattered boulders for cover. The skulls adjusted their approach, spreading out to cut off his potential escape routes. Frank recognized the tactic in an attempt to herd him toward a dead end or a cleared area where he would be exposed. Reynolds, a voice called out, halting Frank mid-stride. He knew that voice. Richard Mitchell. I know it's you up there, old man. Frank remained silent, using the distraction to slip behind a large pine tree. Below, he could now see Richard standing with one of the broken skulls, both men looking up towards where Frank had been moments before. You think you're helping her? Richard continued, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. All you've done is make it worse. Sarah and Emma are coming home with me today one way or another. The only question is whether you and your biker friends leave here in cuffs or body bags. Frank considered his options. He could continue the diversion, drawing more attention to himself and away from the shack. But that strategy had diminishing returns. The longer he remained isolated on the ridge, the greater the chance of being surrounded and captured or killed. A new sound caught his attention, faint but distinctive. Motorcycle engines distant but approaching. Reinforcements were coming, but for which side remained to be seen. Frank made his decision. Using the ridge as cover, he began making his way toward the shack, moving quickly but carefully from tree to tree. The broken skulls were still focused on his previous position, giving him a small window of opportunity. The drainage channel Lucas had used earlier now presented itself as Frank's best route. He slipped down the steep embankment, landing heavily in the dry stream bed. The impact sent pain shooting through his knee, a reminder of an old injury that never fully healed. Frank pushed the discomfort aside and began moving along the channel toward the shack. He had covered perhaps half the distance when the sound of motorcycles grew suddenly louder. From his position, Frank couldn't see the approaching riders, but the reaction from the broken skulls was immediate. They regrouped, several taking defensive positions, while others conferred urgently with Richard. Frank used the distraction to close the remaining distance to the shack. As he reached the rear wall, a hand grabbed his shoulder. He spun, raising the shotgun, only to find Kid Jenkins staring back at him. Inside, Kid whispered, gesturing to a low window partially concealed by an overturned water barrel. Quick, they're going to start shooting any second. Frank didn't need to be told twice. He handed the shotgun to Kid, then pulled himself through the narrow opening, landing on the dirt floor of the shack with a grunt. The interior was dim after the morning brightness outside, but as his eyes adjusted, the scene came into focus. The shack consisted of a single room, its walls lined with rusting mining equipment and shelves of ancient canned goods. Bear lay on a makeshift bed of blankets in one corner, his massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Lucas knelt beside him, working with quiet efficiency to stem the blood flowing from a wound in Bear's side. Sarah Mitchell sat with Emma clutched tightly in her arms, the child's face buried against her mother's shoulder. Her blue eyes met Frank's relief washing over her features. Even in this dire situation, Frank could see the strength in her expression, the same determination he'd witnessed when she told him about leaving Eric. Kid climbed in after Frank pulling the window closed behind him. "Readers coming in from the east," he reported. "At least 6, maybe more." "Ours?" Lucas asked without turning from his work on Bear's wound. "Can't tell yet, too far out." Frank moved to the single dirty window facing east, peering through a crack in the frame. Through it, he could see Richard and the broken skulls regrouping their attention, now divided between the shack and the approaching motorcycles. "How bad is Bear?" Frank asked quietly. "Knife wound," Lucas replied. "One of the skulls got him during the ambush. Doc says it missed anything vital, but he's lost a lot of blood." And Sarah and Emma, shaken but unhurt, Bear got them here before he collapsed. Lucas's eyes held a respect Frank hadn't seen before. He took that knife protecting them. Wouldn't leave them even after he was wounded. Frank glanced at the big man, seeing him in a new light. Bear had always been intimidating, a mountain of muscle and tattoos. But beneath that exterior was something Frank recognized. The same protective instinct that had driven Frank's own career in law enforcement. "We can't stay here," Frank said. "This position is too exposed and we're outnumbered." "Agreed," Lucas said. "But our options for moving are limited. There's only one way in or out of this canyon, and they've got it covered." "Maybe not," Frank countered, recalling his mental map of the area. "When I was sheriff, we had a case where some kids got lost in these mountains. During the search, we found an old mine shaft that connects this canyon to the next valley over. It was sealed off decades ago, but the entrance should still be accessible." Hope flickered in Lucas's eyes. "Where behind this shack, maybe 50 yards up against the canyon wall. It would have been used to access the higher veins in the hillside." "Is it stable?" Frank hesitated. "It was when I saw it 15 years ago. Can't make any promises now." The sound of gunfire erupted outside, sharp cracks that sent everyone in the shack ducking for cover. Through the window, Frank saw the approaching riders engage with the broken skulls. The newcomers weren't shooting, however. They were forcing their way through using sheer momentum bikes weaving between the scattered skulls. "It's our guys," Lucas said, recognition evident in his voice. They made it. Indeed, Frank could now see that the approaching riders wore the distinctive leather vests of the Midnight Riders. They had responded to Lucas's emergency call, coming to the aid of their brothers despite the danger. The momentary elation was tempered by reality. Even with these reinforcements, they remained outgunned and in a precarious tactical position. The mine shaft, if accessible, represented their best chance for escape. "Doc," Frank called, "can Bear be moved?" Lucas looked up from his patient. "Not ideally, but if the alternative is staying here to get shot..." "Kid, help Lucas get Bear ready to move," Frank ordered. "I'll check the mine entrance." Frank led Sarah to the rear of the shack. Through a small window, he pointed to a dark shadow in the canyon wall, partially obscured by scrub brush and fallen rocks. "There, it doesn't look like much, but it opens into a tunnel system that runs through the entire mountain." Sarah studied the terrain between the shack and the mine entrance, her analytical mind assessing the danger. "A lot of open ground to cover with a wounded man and a child." "We'll need covering fire," Frank agreed. "Your mom's good at keeping a cool head." "Just like you." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected compliment. "She had to be being married to you." The brief moment of connection was interrupted as Kid joined them. "I can run interference," he offered. "I'm the fastest. Can draw their fire while you get everyone to the mine entrance." Frank and Sarah exchanged looks. The risk was considerable, but they had few alternatives. "No," Sarah said firmly before Frank could respond. "Too dangerous. We need another way." Frank studied the determined set of Sarah's jaw, the same expression he'd seen in the mirror countless times before difficult operations. "What are you thinking? We create a distraction," she said, "something that draws their attention away from both the mine entrance and the shack. Give everyone a chance to move at once." Frank nodded slowly, impressed by her tactical thinking. "What kind of distraction?" Sarah glanced at the rusting mining equipment piled against one wall. "How much gasoline is in that generator outside?" 10 minutes later, their plan was set. The old generator behind the shack, repositioned downhill and rigged with a delayed ignition system, courtesy of Kid's mechanical skills, would provide their diversion. The resulting fire wouldn't harm anyone but would create enough smoke and confusion to cover their escape. Frank gathered everyone for final instructions. When the generator blows, we move in pairs. Kid, you lead with Emma. Lucas and Sarah support Bear. I'll cover the rear. Stay low, move fast, and don't stop until you're inside the mine shaft. Sarah held Emma close, whispering reassurances to the frightened child. Remember what I told you. You're going on an adventure with Kid, just like the treasure hunters in your book. Emma nodded solemnly, her small face composed despite her fear. Will the bad men follow us? No, sweetie, Frank said, kneeling to her level. The tunnel is our secret, and you know what, your grandpa used to explore caves just like this when he was younger. The lie came easily, anything to ease the child's fears. Emma seemed to accept it, her trust in this man she barely knew, both humbling and terrifying to Frank. He wouldn't fail her. Not this time. The explosion, when it came, was more spectacular than they had anticipated. The generator erupted in a fireball that sent a column of black smoke billowing into the canyon. Shouts of alarm rose from the broken skulls, followed by the sound of running feet as they moved to investigate. Now, Frank ordered, throwing open the rear door. They moved as planned, Kid sprinting ahead with Emma in his arms, her face buried against his shoulder. Lucas and Sarah supported Bear between them, the big man gritting his teeth against the pain as they half-carried him across the open ground. Frank brought up the rear shotgun, ready, watching for any threat. The diversion worked better than they dared hope. The broken skulls, believing the explosion might be an attack from the newly arrived Midnight Riders, had repositioned to the east side of the canyon, leaving the path to the mine entrance momentarily clear. Kid reached it first, setting Emma down gently as he began clearing the brush and debris that partially blocked the opening. By the time Lucas and Sarah arrived with Bear, he'd created a passage large enough for them to enter single file. Get inside, Frank urged, watching the smoke begin to dissipate. They'll figure it out soon enough. One by one they entered the dark passage, Bear requiring both Lucas and Kid to maneuver his bulk through the narrow opening. Sarah went next with Emma, leaving Frank alone outside standing guard until they were safely in. He was about to follow when movement caught his eye. Richard Mitchell stood at the corner of the shack, pistol raised and aimed directly at Frank's chest. Their eyes met across the distance, Richard's cold with hatred, Frank's steady with resolve. It doesn't have to end this way, Frank called, keeping his shotgun lowered but ready. Walk away, Richard. Start over somewhere else. Richard's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. After what you've done, turn my wife against me, poison my child's mind. There's no walking away from this, Reynolds. Frank saw Richard's finger tighten on the trigger and knew he had milliseconds to react. He dove to the side as the shot rang out, feeling the bullet pass close enough to ruffle his shirt. Rolling behind a boulder, Frank brought up his shotgun but held his fire. Killing Richard, even in self-defense, would only complicate Carl and Emma's future. Frank, Sarah's voice called from inside the mine entrance, panic evident in her tone. Stay inside, Frank shouted back, keeping his eyes on Richard, who was advancing steadily, using the scattered rocks for cover. Give me back my family, Richard demanded, firing again. The shot chipped stone from the boulder sheltering Frank. They're not possessions, Richard, Frank replied, edging toward the mine entrance while maintaining cover. They're people, with their own choices. Choices you manipulated. Another shot closer this time. You turned them against me. Frank was within 5 yards of the mine entrance now, but Richard had a clear line of sight. Any move to enter would expose him to fire. He needed another distraction. As if in answer to his unspoken need, the distinctive rumble of motorcycles filled the canyon. 3 Midnight Riders appeared around the shack, moving fast toward Richard's position. Richard spun toward the new threat, firing wildly as the riders weaved and dodged. Frank used the moment to make his move, diving through the mine entrance and rolling into the darkness beyond. Behind him, he heard Richard curse, then the sound of pursuing footsteps. Everyone move, Frank ordered, struggling to his feet in the narrow tunnel. He's right behind us. The tunnel extended into the mountain, a black maw barely illuminated by the flashlight Kid had produced from his pack. They moved as quickly as Bear's condition would allow, the wounded man now fully conscious and determinedly walking under his own power, despite Lucas's protests. Sarah carried Emma, the little girl's arms wrapped tightly around her mother's neck. Frank brought up the rear, pausing occasionally to listen for pursuit. Richard's footsteps echoed in the tunnel behind them, sometimes closer, sometimes more distant, but never gone completely. How far does this tunnel go? Sarah asked as they paused at a junction where the passage split in three directions. All the way through the mountain, if memory serves, Frank replied, studying the options. But it's been a long time since I was here. Which way? Lucas asked. Frank closed his eyes, trying to visualize the old mining maps he'd studied during that search and rescue operation years ago. Right, the left and center passages dead end at old dig sites. They took the right fork, the tunnel gradually sloping upward and narrowing further. Bear was struggling more visibly, now his face ashen with pain and blood loss. Need to rest, he gasped, finally slumping against the tunnel wall. Lucas was immediately at his side, checking the bandaged wound. Bleeding started again. We need to stop and redress this. Frank glanced back down the tunnel. No sign of Richard yet, but the man was persistent. Make it quick. 2 minutes, then we move. While Lucas worked on Bear's wound, Sarah set Emma down and approached Frank. He won't stop, will he? She asked quietly. Frank shook his head. Not until he gets what he wants, or someone stops him. This is my fault, Sarah whispered, glancing at Emma, who was watching Lucas tend to Bear with wide, frightened eyes. I should have left years ago before it got this bad. Frank placed a hand on her shoulder. This isn't on you. Never was. He hesitated, then added, I've seen this before. Men like Richard, they make you think you are responsible for their actions. It's how they control you. Sarah studied her father's face, seeing something she hadn't noticed before. Understanding rather than judgment. Is that why you were so adamant about me leaving Eric from the start? You saw the signs. Frank nodded. Occupational hazard of being a cop for 30 years. You recognize the pattern. Before Sarah could respond, a sound echoed up the tunnel, a metallic clang followed by a curse. Richard moving faster than expected. Time's up, Frank said. Everyone ready to move. Bear struggled to his feet with Lucas's help. Ready as I'll ever be. They continued deeper into the mountain, the tunnel now so tight that they had to proceed single file. The air grew cooler and damper, water seeping through cracks in the rock ceiling to form shallow puddles on the floor. Frank estimated they'd traveled nearly half a mile into the mountain when they reached another junction. This time the tunnel branched into two passages that looked equally traveled. Now what? Kid asked, his youthful confidence finally showing cracks. Frank studied both options, his memory failing him. I'm not sure. Feel the air, Bear suggested unexpectedly, his voice weak but determined. Fresh air means a way out. When they stood still, trying to detect any movement of air. Sure enough, a faint breeze could be felt coming from the left passage. Good call, Frank acknowledged, nodding to Bear with newfound respect. They had taken only a few steps down the left tunnel when Richard's voice echoed behind them, closer than expected. I can hear you, Sarah. You can't hide from me, Emma whimpered, burying her face against Sarah's shoulder. The sound seemed to trigger something in Bear, who straightened despite his wound. Get them out, he said to Frank, his voice low but firm. I'll hold him here. No, Lucas protested immediately. You can barely stand. Don't need to stand to pull a trigger. Bear countered, producing a small pistol from his vest. Just need to buy you time. Frank recognized the look in Bear's eyes. The same expression he'd seen countless times in fellow officers willing to put themselves at risk to protect others. It was sacrifice, pure and simple. We go together, Frank said firmly. No one gets left behind. Bear shook his massive head. Think tactically, old man. I'm slowing you down. Can't make it much further anyway. He coughed, a wet sound that suggested internal bleeding. This way I still serve a purpose. Lucas stepped forward, gripping Bear's shoulder. Brother. Go, Bear interrupted. Get the woman and kid to safety. It's what we do. Frank knew they were running out of time. Richard was getting closer by the second, and Bear's logic, while brutal, was sound. The big man was dying, his wound more serious than they'd initially believed. But Frank had left too many people behind in his life. New plan, he said, decision made. You all keep going. I'll stay with Bear. 2 guns are better than 1. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm. Dad, no. Not up for debate, Frank cut her off. Lucas, get them out. Follow the fresh air. It'll lead to a surface opening. Lucas held Frank's gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. We'll send help as soon as we're out. Frank turned to Sarah and Emma, knowing this might be the last time he saw them. He placed his hand on Emma's small back, then met Sarah's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for everything." Sarah's expression shifted from fear to understanding to determination in rapid succession. Then, surprising Frank completely, she pulled him into a fierce, brief hug. "Don't you dare die down here," she whispered fiercely. "We just found you again." Before Frank could respond, she pulled away, took Emma's hand, and followed Lucas and Kid down the tunnel without looking back. Frank watched until they disappeared around a bend, then turned to Bear, who had positioned himself against the tunnel wall, pistol ready. "You didn't have to stay," Bear said, his breathing labored. "Yes, I did," Frank replied, checking his shotgun one last time. "I've left too many people behind in my life. Not doing it again." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to Richard's approach grow steadily closer. Frank could tell by the footsteps that the deputy was moving more cautiously, now aware he was being led into a potential trap. "Why'd you do it?" Frank asked quietly. "Take a knife for a woman and child you barely know." Bear's expression remained stoic, but something shifted in his eyes. "Had a sister once. Husband used her as a punching bag for years. Nobody helped. Not even me, not enough." He coughed again, grimacing with pain. "Told myself if I ever got another chance to stop something like that, I would." Frank nodded, understanding completely. "Second chances don't come around often." "No," Bear agreed. "They don't." Richard's voice echoed from around the bend in the tunnel. "I know you're there, Reynolds. No way out." Frank raised his shotgun, aimed at the point where Richard would appear. "One warning, Mitchell. Turn around and walk away. No one else needs to get hurt today." A harsh laugh answered him. "Little late for that, isn't it? You've taken everything from me. My family, my reputation. What do I have left to lose?" "Your life," Frank answered simply. "Don't throw it away for pride." Richard appeared suddenly, moving fast and low, his pistol extended before him. Frank held his fire, still hoping to resolve the situation without bloodshed. Bear had no such compunction. His pistol barked twice, the sound deafening in the confined space. Richard jerked backward as one round grazed his shoulder, but maintained his footing and returned fire. 3 rapid shots, one striking Bear in the chest. The big man slumped further, but kept his weapon trained on the tunnel entrance. "Last chance, Mitchell," Frank warned, finger tightening on the trigger. "Drop the gun." "You drop yours," Richard countered, partially concealed around the bend, "or the next shot goes through your head." The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours in the dim tunnel. Frank knew his position was exposed, but lowering his weapon would mean certain death for both him and Bear. Richard, for all his faults, had been a competent deputy with excellent marksmanship. Suddenly, a new sound echoed through the tunnel from behind Richard. Running footsteps, multiple sets approaching fast. Richard turned slightly at the noise, his concentration broken for a critical moment. Frank seized the opportunity, firing a single round from the shotgun. The blast caught Richard in the leg, not a killing shot, but enough to send him crashing to the ground, his pistol skittering away across the rough stone floor. Before Richard could recover, 3 figures rounded the bend behind him, weapons drawn, the Midnight Riders having followed them into the mine. "Cavalry's here," one of them announced, unnecessarily kneeling to secure Richard, who lay clutching his bleeding leg and cursing continuously. Frank lowered his shotgun, the adrenaline that had sustained him suddenly draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He turned to Bear, intending to check the man's new wound, only to find the big biker's eyes closed his chest still. "No," Frank muttered, moving quickly to Bear's side. "No, no, no." Lucas pushed past the others, dropping to his knees beside his fallen brother. His medical training took over as he checked for vital signs, then immediately began CPR. "Get him out of here," he ordered the others, nodding toward Richard. "And find Sarah and the others. Tell them it's safe." For 10 minutes, Lucas worked tirelessly to revive Bear, refusing to give up even when Frank gently suggested it was too late. Finally exhausted, he sat back on his heels. "He's gone," Lucas said, his voice hollow. "Bled out internally. Nothing anyone could have done." Frank placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, offering silent support. Words seemed inadequate for the sacrifice they had just witnessed. Together, they carried Bear's body through the tunnel, following the path Sarah and the others had taken earlier. The passage gradually widened the ceiling, rising until they emerged finally into daylight through a small cave entrance, half hidden by scrub pine. Outside, they found Sarah, Emma, and Kid waiting with the 3 riders who had arrived at the crucial moment. Sarah rushed forward at the sight of her father, relief evident on her face, then stopped short when she saw the burden he and Lucas carried. "Oh no," she whispered instinctively, turning Emma away from the sight. "Is he—" Frank nodded grimly. "Saved both our lives, held on just long enough." They laid Bear's body gently on the ground as Lucas arranged his jacket over the fallen man's face, a gesture of respect and dignity. The Midnight Riders gathered around, forming a circle of leather and denim heads, bowed in silent tribute. Emma tugged at Sarah's hand, her small face solemn with understanding beyond her years. "Is the big man in heaven now, Mommy?" Sarah knelt beside her daughter, brushing hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. He was very brave." "Like Grandpa," Emma said with the simple certainty of childhood. Sarah's eyes met Frank's over Emma's head. "Yes," she agreed softly, "exactly like Grandpa." The words hit Frank with unexpected force, a recognition he'd never thought to receive from his daughter. He looked away, blinking rapidly against the sudden moisture in his eyes. Lucas approached, his expression grim but composed. "Richard's been secured. He'll need medical attention, but he'll live to face charges." "Good," Frank said firmly. "He needs to answer for what he's done, all of it." As they prepared to leave the mountain, Frank found himself standing alone for a moment, looking back at the mine entrance that had provided their escape. So many twists of fate had led to this moment. Sarah's decision to flee her abusive husband, Frank's intervention at the diner bear sacrifice, a chain of choices and consequences that would forever alter all their lives. Lucas joined him, following his gaze. "What happens now?" Frank considered the question. "Richard goes to jail. Sarah and Emma get a fresh start." He turned to look at Lucas. "And you?" "The Midnight Riders take care of their own," Lucas replied. "Bear will have a proper send-off. Then we keep doing what we've always done, looking out for those who need protection." Frank nodded in understanding the code by which these men lived, not so different perhaps from his own. "And you, Frank?" Lucas asked. "Back to the quiet life at the service station." Frank looked toward where Sarah stood with Emma, the two of them silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "Not quiet, I hope. Not anymore." Epilogue. 6 months later. Spring came early to Riverford, painting the mountains with wildflowers and fresh green pine. Frank Reynolds stood in the doorway of his newly rebuilt service station, watching as customers filled the expanded parking lot. The insurance money had covered most of the reconstruction, with Lucas and the Midnight Riders contributing labor and materials to create something bigger and better than before. Inside, Sarah moved efficiently behind the new counter, handling the morning coffee rush with professional ease. Her decision to stay in Riverford had surprised Frank initially, but her explanation had made perfect sense. "Emma needs stability and you need family. Simple as that." They'd established a routine over the months. Sarah had found work as a nurse at the local clinic, using her medical training while pursuing recertification for more advanced practice. Emma had settled into the elementary school, making friends and slowly recovering from the trauma of their escape. And Frank had discovered that being a grandfather suited him far better than he'd ever imagined. The bell above the door jingled as Sheriff Bill Thompson entered, nodding to Frank as he approached. "Morning, Frank. Just got word from the prosecutor's office. Richard's taking the plea deal. 20 years, no possibility of parole for at least 15. Frank nodded, satisfaction rather than pleasure coursing through him. "Good. Sarah won't have to testify." "That's the idea," Thompson agreed. "Emma either." Richard's trial had been delayed repeatedly by legal maneuvering, but the evidence against him had been overwhelming. Between the assault charges, the arson, and his alliance with the Broken Skulls, his fate had been sealed. The plea agreement meant Sarah and Emma could truly move forward without the ordeal of court testimony. "How's the new deputy working out?" Frank asked, changing the subject. "It's awesome." Thompson smiled. "Jenkins is green but eager to learn. Got good instincts." Kid Jenkins had surprised everyone by applying to the sheriff's department 3 months after the events at the mine. Even more surprising had been Thompson's decision to hire him, despite his association with the Midnight Riders. But as the sheriff had explained to Frank, sometimes you need different perspectives in law enforcement. Besides, anyone willing to put himself between a child in danger has the right stuff in my book. The sound of motorcycles announced the arrival of Lucas and several riders, their bikes gleaming in the morning sun as they pulled into the parking lot. Relations between the sheriff's department and the motorcycle club had evolved into something resembling mutual respect, if not quite friendship. Lucas dismounted first, removing his helmet as he approached Frank and Thompson. "Sheriff, Frank." He nodded to each in turn. "Just wanted to drop this off before we head out." He handed Frank an envelope. Inside was a photograph of Bear standing proud beside his motorcycle, along with a simple card signed by every member of the Midnight Riders. The inscription read, "For Emma's college fund, Bear would have wanted it." Attached was a bank statement showing a substantial deposit made in Emma's name, accessible when she turned 18. "Lucas, this is," Frank began. "Non-negotiable," Lucas interrupted with a slight smile. "Bear had no family except us. This is what brothers do." Frank nodded, accepting the gift with the gravity it deserved. "Thank you. I'll make sure she knows where it came from when she's old enough to understand." Inside the station, Emma had appeared behind the counter, helping Sarah arrange pastries on a display tray. The little girl caught sight of the visitors and waved enthusiastically, her smile bright and unguarded in a way it hadn't been 6 months earlier. "Looks like you've got yourself a good setup here," Thompson observed, watching the interaction between Sarah and Emma. "Better than I deserve," Frank agreed quietly. "Nah," Lucas countered. "Exactly what you deserve. What you all deserve." As the men continued talking, Frank felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for decades. The violence and danger of that day at the mine would always be part of their story, as would the grief of Bear's sacrifice. But those events had also forged new bonds, created unexpected alliances, and given Frank something he'd thought forever lost: a second chance at family. Sarah called from inside, announcing fresh coffee was ready. The three men moved toward the door, momentarily framed together: the sheriff, the biker, and the former deputy turned station owner. An unlikely trio bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Frank paused at the threshold, looking back at the mountains that had nearly claimed them all. Somewhere up there, a mine entrance remained hidden among the pines, a reminder of how quickly life could change, how precious second chances truly were. Then he turned and stepped inside toward his daughter and granddaughter, toward the future they would build together.